Welcome back, guys. Mike Burrows from StanceWorks here. This is the Turbo K24 swap Ferrari 308. And in the last episode, we started removing the interior from this car. Today, we're going to pick up right where we left off. We've still got quite a bit to remove. We've got a dashboard, all sorts of analog gauges, carpet, wiring, all sorts of stuff. Before we dive in though, I do want to stop and say thank you to everyone for supporting this channel so far, and for those of you who keep coming back for more. If you have not subscribed yet, please do so. I've been trying to put out videos every Tuesday and every Thursday as I work on this thing, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us. If you didn't catch it in the beginning, this car will be at H&R's booth at SEMA, if SEMA happens this year, and it will be competing in Super Lap Battle in November, presuming we get all the bugs worked out. So we've got a lot of work to get done, and I'm excited to keep sharing all of that with you guys. So to that end, let's stop wasting time and get this thing torn apart. So you guys watch me get started figuring out how on earth this dash actually comes apart and start disassembling some other things. I figure I'll give you guys a little bit of an explanation following the last episode because I got a lot of questions. Plenty of you guys are wondering why I would start with such a nice car. I've done a lot of builds in the past that have started with rough, dilapidated examples in hopes of improving them as I go down the line. The problem with this is you wind up missing a lot of key components that you need to finish the project. And I learned this the hard way on my first Model A that I built. It was missing pretty much everything aside from the body itself, and that proved to be very difficult when trying to build a complete vehicle. Given the fact that Ferrari parts are hard to find, I didn't want to buy something that was largely incomplete, but I was willing to buy something that needed a lot of work, especially if I could find something that didn't have an engine or a transmission in it. Given that though, it is very, very difficult to find these cars in an incomplete state. I have a feeling they're not sold that way very often. I found a lot of Target tops that were quite a bit cheaper and in worse condition, but that just wasn't an option for me. It's not what I was looking for. With this coupe that I have, it truly is the best example I could find for the money. It is not ultimately the cheapest car I could have bought. However, any car that was worse off than this one was substantially more expensive. I got lucky and got a really nice car for a very fair price. That is why I'm starting with this example. Dashboard's out, and I've got two things to say about it. So one, I'm gonna hand it to Ferrari on this car. Pretty much every time I dive into a project, I expect it to be a lot more difficult than it has been. This car is actually quite easy to work on. Every time that I've jumped into something, it's very doable. It's relatively thought out. I'm not saying it's all a breeze. I mean, it is an Italian exotic car, but even compared to working on pretty much any classic BMW I've worked on, it's right there with them. It's simple to use and to operate. And if you own one of these and want to enjoy it as it came from Italy, I wouldn't say that it's really hard to work on. The dashboard isn't quite as easy as the internet made it out to be though. So it's easier than I expected. I expect dashboards to be an absolute nightmare. Got this thing out and it took about an hour. Some people online said this job is a 10-minute job. You can even do it leaving the steering wheel in. Totally impossible. No way. Now, will it take a full hour for everyone? No. It took me a while to figure out that the major hardware that holds this thing in isn't even inside the car. You get it from the outside in the door frame. Wasn't totally intuitive, but once I found them, pretty easy to get out. Now, the clamshell that is on the steering column, I never saw anybody say that you have to take that off. I would not do this job again leaving it on. I tore up the leather a little bit trying to get the dash out, and if I were going to keep this dash the way that it is, I'd be pretty upset about it. But since I knew that I'm gonna recover it, I wasn't too frustrated about it. Anybody else that works on one of these, take that part out too. That's my suggestion. All right, let's keep going. With the dashboard out, you can see there is a lot of wiring in this car, considering there's not a ton to actually run in here. So I think I'm gonna pull all of this out because all of this is really antiquated, these relay boards, this stuff's heavy, and it's just the old school way of doing it. I wanna put a PDM in this car, which is a power distribution module, and we'll go over what that is and how it works in another episode, but it's gonna allow us to get rid of all of this stuff. We're going to rewire the car from scratch because aside from the engine system and its kind of accessories like the fuel and whatnot, really all that we need to wire up is things like windows and lights. There's not a ton else to the car that we're going to need. So let's start figuring out how some of this stuff comes out. And then underneath here, we've got to get this blower motor out. And it's big. I don't know if you can see it yet. We'll get to it. So I know you guys want to see the little details and the nitty-gritty, and I can't imagine removing a wire harness is very interesting to see, but I'll show you what I'm working on right this moment. I want to get this just huge main body harness out of the car completely. I don't want any of it anymore. And parts of it pass through the firewall and go to the front of the car. Now, on the other side of the car, they pass through in big amounts, and it's going to be really easy to follow. It goes to things like the headlights and the fans, stuff like that. But in a couple places it goes through small like this one, and I have no idea where it goes. So now I gotta go to the engine bay and track it down, figure out where it unplugs so that I can backtrack it through the firewall and out. Because in order to get this thing out in one piece without cutting it, which I don't wanna do, this harness is going to be useful to somebody. We gotta keep it all intact. I apologize if it's tough to see under one side of the hood because it is a bit dark, but what I'm doing right now is just unplugging all of the underhood modules, such as the pop-up headlight motors, the bulbs, the corner lights, and the wiring for the fans and the horn. The other thing that I want to do while I'm under the hood is remove the cables that were for the AC and heater vents. Lastly, there's a couple of wires that are attached to the brake system, which I imagine are for the brake light. It's probably a pressure switch. So I just finished getting most of the wiring out of the engine bay. It needs to just get pulled through the firewall. But that wire I showed you guys earlier, I think is behind this panel. And I've noticed there's some screws down here and up top, and there's kind of a gasket. I think this guy comes out. We gotta figure out what's behind this so we can get it unplugged. When I pulled this panel out, it was pretty clear it's never been removed before. One side of it was completely adhered to the body of the car. All right, in retrospect, I guess it should have been pretty obvious what was hiding back here. It's the windshield wiper motor and all the armature and fixture to hold it. I don't know if I'm gonna pull this stuff out yet. Windshield wipers are pretty useful, but so is Rain-X, and this is good for quite a few pounds. Here's our plug that we need to unplug. That's what we were on the hunt for. So let's get this guy out and see if we can't get the rest of the harness undone. So that didn't work out. I found out very quickly that this plug is too big to go through the hole in the firewall, and that means that either there's some magic done down on the other end of the harness, which I could not find easily, or that this plug was placed on these wires after they were passed through the firewall, and that's not uncommon to have happen. It's kind of frustrating, but normally these are possible to take apart. I'm going to show you how I'm going to take apart this one. That's not going to translate to every plug that you find on every car. There's a lot of different types of connectors, but a lot of them work the same way that this one does, and if you kind of understand how I take this one apart, it might help you when you're trying to unplug something on your car too. So let's see if I can get the camera in here and get it lit, because I got to do it here in the car. So this here is our connector, and I've gone on and pulled two of these out just to make sure I've got my process right, and so I can show you what we're doing inside of this. So each of these slots is where a spade goes on the other side of the connector, and each of these squares is where this pin sits and locks the connector into place. And the whole idea is to go into this square, like this, and push this pin downwards into the connector, and it will free it from the assembly. And it's not always the easiest thing to do. This can be very tricky to pull off sometimes. Depends on how stubborn the whole thing is, and in my case, these are pretty stubborn. I'm not having an easy time with it, but they do come out, and it just takes a little bit of patience sometimes. Gotta finagle it, gotta pry against it, but eventually they will pop out. And that's the back side, and they slide into that. And so it's important, make sure you know where these go on your connector so you can put them back correctly. And also you may find that they slightly deform as you pull them out. You can flatten them back out by putting a new spade into them, and you'll want to push this tab back up so that it will lock it back into place. So I finally found the first hard part of working on this car. I spoke too soon. For the last, I don't know, 30, 45 minutes, I've been working on getting the rear wiring harness undone where it's attached to the taillights and all that kind of stuff. And I meant to be recording it, forgot to hit record, so you missed that, big whoop. The downside is the wiring harness passes behind the gas tank. Not behind it, but it's behind a folded piece of metal that's sandwiched behind the gas tank. The gas tank has to come out. Getting the back half of this wiring harness just turned into a much bigger project, and that's kind of unfortunate. I really wanted to just get the whole thing out in one fell swoop, and I'm really on the home stretch of it. Now I'm trying to decide, do I go on and focus on that? Do I get that blower motor out? What should I do? Since I started up front, I think I'm gonna go on and see if I can get that blower motor and that evaporator out and see where we stand. And depending on how much time's left, maybe I'll start this tonight, maybe that's what I work on tomorrow. It's kicking my butt at the moment. I know it's tough to see from pretty much any camera angle, but I'm just working on getting this blower motor out from under the dash. Thankfully, it's only held in by 4 bolts, although there is one AC fitting that passes through the firewall that was somewhat tricky to get to pass through. The real challenge was just getting the unit separated from the plastic tubing that attaches it to the vents on the top side of the dash, I think mainly just due to age. Once I got that out though, the entire unit came right out, and the whole process only took a few minutes. I think it could even be done with the dash in place. So she's out, and I just got it off the scale. Comes in at about 10.5 pounds, which honestly, really isn't all that heavy. None of the components that have come off of this car have been surprisingly large in weight, aside from the engine itself. And I think that goes to show that it's really the chassis of this car that's the heavy aspect of it, what makes it heavy, at least in my opinion. And I think that tells us this car's never really gonna be a featherweight vehicle, even if I went as far as to put composite or fiberglass panels on the whole thing, because those do exist, and there are versions of this car that came that way from Ferrari. But I think we're talking about like a 200-pound, give or take, weight difference overall, not a ton. And the work involved in converting the whole body to fiberglass is enormous. It's not worth that level of work to me. The weight aspect of this car isn't all there is to it. So even though it won't be incredibly light, I'm still in love with it. There's still a lot more to this car than that factor alone. I don't want to destroy this car looking for weight. And I know plenty of you guys are probably thinking, Mike, you are destroying it. What are you talking about? And we'll leave that discussion for a different time. But for me, we're looking for that balance between weight loss and practicality. So let's get the interior cleaned up. I want to reassess, see where we're at. Looking at the clock today, I do know I need to get home and get started on editing very soon if I want to get this video up by tomorrow. But I'm feeling motivated and I want to cross several things off my list. So I think I'm gonna go pull that fuel tank and get this wiring harness out of the car. So if we're taking a quick look at how this thing comes out, I know it's kind of dark in here, but we've got a pair of straps, one that runs vertically around the tank and one that runs horizontally. And they have these interesting kind of bolted connections underneath that we will have to unthread, which will allow the strap to hinge on a top hinge that's buried way up there. As far as connections go, we've got one that's coming out for the fuel pump, one on the other side that goes for the cross pipe to the other tank on the other side of the car, and we've got to get the filler neck disconnected so that this whole thing can drop out. I don't know how much fuel is in here. We did drain them earlier, but I know that there's probably still going to be a bit, so it's not going to be super light, but we got to take it out. So let's get started on it. As said, the first thing to remove here is the straps, and then I focused on the filler neck, which was somewhat tricky to get off because the hose that holds it on is a bit too short to get out. It took some muscle. I did forget about the return lines on the top of the tank too, but once those were out, the whole thing slid out, and it just barely cleared the fenders with the suspension still on the car. So with the fuel tank out of the way, you can see kind of what we're dealing with. We've got this clamp here that we got to get it undone, and it's somebody, I don't know if Ferrari did this or not, but it's the heat shielding cut and wrapped around, and then it's routed behind this little guy and between this. So like this was pinched behind the fuel tank here, so we got to get that pulled out of the way. Now we can get the wiring harness out of here. And of course, somebody decided to route it up and over the pull cable for the rear hatch. So it's got to come over that and then back around this, out of here, and through that hole down there. We also got to unhook the fuel pumps, but I think that should be it. I am a mess. I am worn out. This is a job. Forgot all about the charging harness that was still kind of attached to the chassis underneath, and all sorts of stuff's been rolling around under the car. Finally got this harness pulled out of this thing, and it is a monster. Just, it's all wrapped in really old, really hard looming. It's, that's a job. I don't envy anybody that has to do this on a car they plan on keeping all of this stuff for. I haven't damaged any of it, but this is not fun. But that whole rear harness is off. Means we just got to get the front pulled through. Last couple things disconnected, I think. And that's all of the wiring out of this car, and I think it's going to be really heavy. So we'll see. Let's go. The process for removing the front half of the wiring harness is the same as the rear. I had to pull it all through one hole, but thankfully all of the connectors fit without too much of an issue. As the harness came out of the car, there were still a few small bits and pieces still connected to things inside. I had to cut a bit of tape, and then the whole thing came out in one piece. I was pulling that wiring harness out and found this little guy in here. And it's funny because I never saw where it came from. So one of you guys will have to look back at the high speed and see where it was, because I have no idea. It's clearly been here a long time though, because he's rock solid. He's completely petrified, completely mummified. So we're going to give him a proper funeral by tossing him right in the trash can. It's finished cleanup. The last thing on the list is just vacuuming out the interior, and I was careful to grab all of the screws, nuts, and bolts that I had taken off so I didn't suck anything important up. Whew. It's been a full day. Most progress I've crammed into a day in a long time, and it feels really good, really rewarding. I got way more done than I expected to today, and that makes for a really good day. Getting that entire body harness out feels fantastic. I thought there would be kind of a division in the wiring between front and rear half of the car, but there wasn't. So realizing that the entire thing had to come out in one go was a bit daunting, but it's done, it's out of the car. I put it on the scales and we're talking about 30 pounds of weight, which is pretty heavy for the wiring. We're gonna be dropping that by a lot, and I'm excited to wire this car from the ground up, from scratch. I really enjoy kind of the wiring process. I know some people shy away from that kind of thing, but I'm excited to show you guys at least how I get it done. I'm not a wiring master, but I at least like to do it. With the wiring out of the car, it means the interior is pretty much fully stripped. There's no wiring left in it except for kind of little pigtails that are attached to random things, but it's empty now. There's no carpet, no nothing. All that remains is pretty much insulation and adhesion that's still stuck to the sheet metal. And I think in the next episode, we're gonna start tackling that and get the inside cleaned up for the next step of kind of the interior build out of this thing while we're waiting on engine stuff and suspension and that kind of stuff. I really appreciate you guys watching along, being a part of this build. I'm having a blast putting these episodes together. I'm having a blast with you guys following along, and I'm already eager for tomorrow so I can come back in and keep making progress on this thing and, you know, get closer and closer to the finish line. So thank you guys for watching. I'm excited for the next episode. Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'll catch you in the next one.